Hey guys, today we're going to be talking about the IS curve. So I'll start just talking about the IS&P model kind of broadly, and then we can dive into the IS curve specifically. Economists use the IS&P model to understand the business cycle, and some of the main assumptions of the IS&P model would be that prices and wages are sticky in the short run. There's three main curves in the IS&P model, the IS curve, the MP curve, and the Phillips curve. And we're going to focus in on the IS curve, which represents goods market equilibrium. So once again, on the IS curve represents equilibrium in the goods market. And it's important to probably start with aggregate expenditure and talk about spending and production, and then kind of show how that relates to the IS curve specifically. So total spending, also known as aggregate expenditure, would be represented as the following formula. Aggregate expenditure would be equal to the combination of consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. And equilibrium in the goods market occurs when aggregate expenditure equals your total goods supplied, denoted by Y. And we kind of know from previous lectures that real GDP is also denoted by Y, and that represents total goods supplied, since Y is the total value of goods produced. So this means that in a goods market equilibrium, you'd have aggregate expenditure would be equal to Y, or real GDP. Continuing on, we can talk about some changes in aggregate expenditure that would impact Y. So if aggregate expenditure is smaller than Y, then some goods that were produced were not purchased. Therefore, inventories would rise. Y and employment will decline. If aggregate expenditure is larger than Y, then spending was greater than the amount of goods that were produced, and therefore inventories would fall, and Y and employment will increase. So now we can kind of put this onto a graph to get a graphical representation of it. You'll have the blue line here, which is our equilibrium. Aggregate expenditure is equal to Y. That's our 45-degree line. The blue line here can also be represented as total production. So just kind of know that the blue line would be your total production. And then here we'll have our total spending. And you can kind of see you have your consumption, your investment, your government spending. This orange line here is spending. All right, so what happens when aggregate expenditure is more or greater than real GDP? Well, as you can see here, it's greater than your real GDP. So you have total spending, which is the orange line, with greater than total production, which leads to a decrease in inventory. And what firms are going to do is actually increase production then. And so you'll kind of get this equilibrium to go back to its initial position. All right, so what happens when aggregate expenditure is less than real GDP? Well, kind of the opposite thing's going to happen. You're going to have total production being greater than total consumption. So you'll actually get a buildup and an increase in inventory. And so what happens is firms are going to actually shut down production or lower production, and this will cause equilibrium to kind of get back into place at this AE1 and Y1 spot right here. All right, so let's talk about the IS curve specifically and then the shifters of it. Well, what is the IS curve? The IS curve shows that the relationship between changes in real interest rates and real GDP when the goods market is in equilibrium. So in this graph, we can see that the horizontal axis is the output gap instead of the real GDP. And the reason for this is that the output gap is kind of a better measure of the business cycle, as it considers the differences between real GDP and potential GDP. And the equilibrium points from the equilibrium goods market model are used to form the IS curve. It is also worth mentioning that the output gap is 0 at equilibrium. And so if it's 0, then there's got to be some things that will move the output gap, either positively or negatively, and we're going to talk about those now. And so those are going to be the shifters here. So the first thing to note is that a change in real interest rate is going to just be a movement along the IS curve. Any other factor that influences aggregate expenditure will be a shift in the IS curve. And so some of the main ones are going to be down here as listed. So a change in consumption, a change in investment expenditure, government spending, net exports, etc. These are the main factors that are going to shift the IS curve, and you can kind of see that right in the aggregate expenditure formula. So as consumption, investment, government expenditure, net exports change, so will aggregate expenditure, and so will the IS curve. All right, so now let's go into an example, and this is going to help really illustrate the point. how does a decrease in consumption and investment affect the curve? Well, let's think about this kind of logically. If we get a decrease in consumption and investment, let's go back to this formula actually. It's really important to remember this formula. If we get a decrease in consumption and investment, what's going to happen is aggregate expenditure is going to shift left. So what's going to happen to the S-curve? Well, the same thing would happen. You'll get a shift left. So we know that if consumption and investment go down, aggregate expenditure goes down too. And so the effect is a shift left. And it's key to note that the real interest rate stays the same, but the output gap actually becomes negative. So actual GDP would be less than potential GDP. And then that means that the economy is producing below its long run capacity. All right, so that's pretty much it. Here's my citations for this video, and I really appreciate your time. Thanks so much, guys.